Especially appreciate your testimony. It's clear-eyed and hard-nosed, as you would expect from a seasoned statesman and military man like yourself who spent a lot of time on the battlefield and less time in the halls of the Pentagon. So thank you. Because I think there are some important lessons for the administration and Democrats to learn and also Republicans to learn. I just want to revisit a few points of your testimony to make sure I have it correct. It sounds like one key point you're making is it's possible to support Ukraine without supporting President Biden's Ukraine policy. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if I could synthesize the critique I've heard about President Biden's Ukraine policy, maybe down to a few points. First, in 2021, he did what Winston Churchill cautioned that we should never do with dictatorships, but especially Russia, gave them temptations to a trial of strength by giving away the store on the New START Treaty and Nord Stream 2, turning the cheek on the colonial pipeline hack, inviting him to a big summit in Europe. Is that one part of your critique is that President Biden tempted Vladimir Putin to achieve what he's always wanted to achieve, which is subjugating Ukraine to a new Russian empire?
Yes, Senator, does. Senator, I'm a big believer in patterns. We all have patterns. We go to the store the same way, buy the same service station, and so do leaders. And Putin saw in the leadership of President Biden a pattern, and he was able to exploit it.
Second, over the year of the war, it sounds to me like your critique is that President Biden and the administration have been pussyfooting around their support for Ukraine. It's constantly providing them just enough to avoid a catastrophic defeat, not enough to win. It's, as you say, a pattern we've seen from the very beginning. We'll give them ammunition, but not artillery. We'll give them artillery, but not HIMARS. We'll give them HIMARS, but not armor. We'll give them Bradleys, but not Abrams. We'll give them Abrams, but not cluster munitions and F-16, which is where we are now. And therefore, these dragged out the war longer than we should have if we had just provided Ukraine with what it needed to defend its territory from the very beginning. Am I right about that?
You're correct, Senator. Senator, and you'll appreciate this. It's like doing a river crossing. Once from the near bank to the far bank, you don't get in the middle on a river crossing and decide it was not a good idea. Yeah. Once you commit, you go.
And to a point you were making earlier, and Senator Kaine discussed with you, is that President Biden keeps talking about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, which is a substitute for helping Ukraine win as quick as it can. Is that right?
I believe so, because if this goes to a long-range fight, it's an endless war, and they cannot win a war of attrition.
Yeah, so from the beginning, it shouldn't have been about supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. It should be helping them win as quick as they can. For the record, Senator Kaine talked a lot about seeing through the rearview mirror. I think you were making these very points a year ago, weren't you, when you were looking through the windshield, not the rearview mirror?
Correct, sir.
And I think a lot of us were. And then the third critique, after the first one, that President Biden tempted Vladimir Putin to go for the jugular, and then he spent a year pussyfooting around in its support for Ukraine, is that he's also allowed Europe to get away with not doing enough, especially on financial support, and in particular, Germany, France, and the European Union. Is that right?
I believe Europe has been very laggard.
Okay. Now, I also hear you making a few other points as well that I want to pursue. Sometimes we hear criticism of President Biden that he seems to care more about Ukraine's borders than America's borders. I think that's a fair criticism of President Biden. But it sounds like you believe that it's the case that you can care about America's borders and protect our borders while also help other countries protect their borders too. Is that right?
That is correct, Senator.
Or recently, since the terrible train wreck in East Palestine, Ohio, and President Biden's trip to Kyiv last week, I've heard some say that the president will go to Kyiv, but he won't go to East Palestine. I agree, that's a fair criticism of President Biden. It sounds to me like you think it's possible to both. Sometimes we hear criticism of President Biden that he seems to care more about Ukraine's borders than America's borders. I think that's a fair criticism of President Biden. But it sounds like you believe that it's the case that you can care about America's borders and protect our borders while also help other countries protect their borders too. Is that right?
That is correct, Senator.
Or recently, since the terrible train wreck in East Palestine, Ohio, and President Biden's trip to Kyiv last week, I've heard some say that the president will go to Kyiv, but he won't go to East Palestine. I agree, that's a fair criticism of President Biden. It sounds to me like you think it's possible to both go to East Palestine and support the people there who've been harmed by this train wreck, but also travel to Kyiv and show our support for the Ukrainian people in their fight against this war of aggression from Russia. Is that right?
My experience is that Air Force One can about go anywhere it wants to go.
Thank you for that. Now, in negotiations, we also hear a lot of criticism that we're not doing enough to have a negotiated end to this conflict, that we need to get negotiations underway. I think one of your key points in terms of supporting Ukraine now, backing them to the hilt as quick as we can, not for as long as it takes, is that the only way to get a negotiated settlement is to convince Vladimir Putin he has more to lose on the battlefield than he does at the negotiating table. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator. And what you need to push pressure on him, if he loses his army, he loses. And that's what you put him at risk of.
Senator Cotton.
Mr. Attorney General, I want to return to the illegal protest outside of Supreme Court justices' homes last summer. It's plainly unlawful to protest outside of a judge's home to influence the outcome of a pending case. You testified earlier that as far as you know, no charges have been brought against those protesters, but you never really explained why. Why have no charges been brought against those protesters?
The decision about making arrests is left to the marshals on scene. Their principal
Marshals are law enforcement officials. They're not prosecutors. I did not say arrests. I said charges. These people were not criminal masterminds. They posted videos of themselves on their social media accounts. They advertised the protest in advance. It is possible to arrest someone for an offense after the offense has occurred, has it not?
It is, and
why did you not send anyone to arrest those protesters in the days after the protests?
We're allocating our resources towards protecting the lives of the justices and their families. Decisions have to be made on the ground as to what is the best way to protect those lives.
Mr. Attorney General, do you not think that it would perhaps provide a deterrent effect if you arrested some of these criminal protesters and charged them and threw them in federal prison?
We are trying to protect the lives of the justices. That is our principal priority. I'm leaving it to the Marshal Service to make determinations on the ground. They have to make determinations about what they see on the ground.
Look, consider the efforts your department has put into tracking down everyone who was even on the Capitol grounds on January 6, 2021. You've dedicated millions of man-hours to study videotape, to do forensic analysis of computers and devices, to go knock and conduct interviews. You can't allocate just a few agents to look at people's social media accounts and say they were present outside of a justice's home, we're going to go arrest them and charge them. It's a black letter violation of the law.
Our priority is violence and threats of violence and protection of the lives of the justices, and that is what we're doing.
Again, these are not criminal masterminds. They posted pictures and videos of themselves protesting. You could probably go arrest one today from a cold start. Why can't you do that?
I'm saying again, our purpose is to protect the lives and safety of the justices. That's how we're allocating resources.
You sent the FBI, as several senators pointed out, to do an early morning raid on Mark Houck's home in front of his children for the grave crime of singing hymns and saying prayers outside of an abortion clinic, charges of which he was acquitted by a jury of his peers within an hour. You can't send the FBI to track down anybody who is protesting outside the home of a Supreme Court justice?
And I want to be clear, our purpose here is to protect the lives and safety of the justices.
I think
that's why we're doing that.
The answer is that you are sympathetic to the protesters, that you didn't like the decision the justices were about to issue. I think we all know what you would do if a bunch of conservative protesters were outside the home of a Democratic appointed justice to the Supreme Court.
No one has ever been arrested under that
statute. It's a
statute
simple
under those
black-letter legal violation. You will not send a single agent to conduct a single arrest and charge them on something that they have zero defense for. It's because you're sympathetic to left-wing protesters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Attorney General, I want to go back to what...
Attorney General, I want to explore the dangerous crisis at our southern border and your role in causing that crisis. Asylum traditionally is reserved for people who face things like religious persecution, persecution for their political beliefs, or violence because of their race or ethnicity. In June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence in their home country. Is that 2021 interpretation still in place?
It is. It reinstates a previous interpretation that the department had of the same asylum rules, yes.
Okay. Do you know the most recent murder rate in Honduras?
I'm sure it's enormously high.
It's 36 per 100,000 people. What about Colombia?
I don't know.
23 per 100,000. Guatemala?
Again, I don't know, but I believe it's quite high.
17 per 100,000. What about Mexico, right across our southern border?
I also think it's very high.
28 per 100,000. So I have to say, since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries, I'm a little surprised you didn't know those, but let's look a little bit closer to home. Do you know the murder rate in New Orleans last year?
I don't, but I want to be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs, where the country was unable to protect the person. That's what it was about. It wasn't about violence in general.
Okay, well, you're partly responsible for protecting Americans. So let's see, Honduras' government can protect its own people except for 36 out of every 100,000 for murders. Guatemala, 17 out of every 100,000. The murder rate in New Orleans last year was 70 for every 100,000. What about St. Louis?
Again, it's very high, I think.
68 per 100,000. What about Baltimore?
Also very high.
58 per 100,000. Should American citizens in places like New Orleans and Baltimore and St. Louis begin to seek asylum in countries like Honduras and Guatemala under your asylum principles?
Again, I'm saying that the principle here is protection of specific individuals who are being threatened by the gang and where the local country is unwilling or unable to protect them.
So is the United States government and the city governments of St. Louis and Baltimore and New Orleans unwilling or unable to protect its own citizens?
I don't believe they're unwilling. They're doing everything that they can. We're supporting them in every way they can. The examples you're talking about are ones where they are unwilling to protect from gangs.
So, Mr. Attorney General, one of the reasons we have a crisis at our border where we have illegal aliens running to our Border Patrol, not away from our Border Patrol, is this interpretation of asylum. That anyone, anywhere who lives in a dangerous or poor country can come here and seek asylum, as opposed to seeking it, as is traditionally the case, for things like persecution on religious belief or political practice. But let's move on, Mr. Attorney General.
But that's not the standard. I want to be clear.
Senator Coons, Senator Cotton.
Mr. Attorney General, I want to explore the dangerous crisis at our southern border and your role in causing that crisis. Asylum traditionally is reserved for people who face things like religious persecution, persecution for their political beliefs, or violence because of their race or ethnicity. In June of 2021, you changed the department's asylum rules so that it could apply to individuals with significant gang violence in their home country. Is that 2021 interpretation still in place?
It is. It reinstates a previous interpretation that the department had of the same asylum rules, yes.
Okay. Do you know the most recent murder rate in Honduras?
I'm sure it's enormously high.
It's 36 per 100,000 people. What about Colombia?
I don't know.
23 per 100,000. Guatemala?
Again, I don't know, but I believe it's quite high.
17 per 100,000. What about Mexico, right across our southern border?
I also think it's very high.
28 per 100,000. So I have to say, since you rewrote the rules of asylum based on the perceived degree of violence in these countries, I'm a little surprised you didn't know those, but let's look a little bit closer to home. Do you know the murder rate in New Orleans last year?
I don't, but I want to be clear, this wasn't based on violence. This is based on threats specifically to individuals, on gangs, where the country was unable to protect the person. That's what it was about. It wasn't about violence in general.
Okay, well, you're partly responsible for protecting Americans. So let's see, Honduras' government can protect its own people except for 36 out of every 100,000 for murders. Guatemala, 17 out of every 100,000. The murder rate in New Orleans last year was 70 for every 100,000. What about St. Louis?
Again, it's very high, I think.
68 per 100,000. What about Baltimore?
Also very high.
58 per 100,000. Should American citizens in places like New Orleans and Baltimore and St. Louis begin to seek asylum in countries like Honduras and Guatemala under your asylum principles?
Again, I'm saying that the principle here is protection of specific individuals who are being threatened by the gang and where the local country is unwilling or unable to protect them.
So is the United States government and the city governments of St. Louis and Baltimore and New Orleans unwilling or unable to protect its own citizens?
I don't believe they're unwilling. They're doing everything that they can. We're supporting them in every way they can. The examples you're talking about are ones where they are unwilling to protect from gangs.
So, Mr. Attorney General, one of the reasons we have a crisis at our border where we have illegal aliens running to our Border Patrol, not away from our Border Patrol, is this interpretation of asylum. That anyone, anywhere who lives in a dangerous or poor country can come here and seek asylum, as opposed to seeking it, as is traditionally the case, for things like persecution on religious belief or political practice. But let's move on, Mr. Attorney General.
But that's not the standard. I want to be clear.
I want to come back to a question that Senator Cornyn started. Your unprecedented memo in December of 2020 to direct your prosecutors not to pursue the most serious, readily provable offense. I have gotten numerous contacts in my office from your prosecutors who are shocked that you have overturned this decades-long bipartisan standard. You said this was about allocating resources. What resources are you talking about?
No prosecutor was directed to not bring a case again. In fact,
your memo specifically says that if they feel that it's not warranted, or only if the other offenses are not sufficient, they should not pursue what has been the standard for decades, generations of U.S. attorneys and their assistants.
I'm well aware of the standard because I helped write the standard originally.
Because it was a Carter administration standard, not specifically known for being tough on crime.
Well, it was the first time the principles of prosecution were reduced to a book which explained what they were. It was included in it. Every assistant U.S. attorney is able to use their discretion to bring these kinds of cases. No one's being directed to not do anything.
You specifically said that they should not pursue the most serious, readily provable offenses in cases where mandatory minimums are present because it's not warranted. You specifically said that.
But I said...
That's the law. What does mandatory mean?
I'm trying to say that...
Does it mean that prosecutors get a choice not to pursue it if we write the law in that way?
The memorandum said that cases of violent crime, which is specifically what you're asking me, are ones where, in fact, it's most likely that they should be bringing the highest and mandatory minimums.
Is it your assertion here that drug trafficking is not a violent crime?
No,
it's
and
built
also,
on an entire foundation and edifice of violence.
Yes, and it includes an exception in the same memorandum we're talking about for significant drug trafficking as well as for violent crime.
So
That's right.
Let's get your specific answer. I wrote it down here. I was so surprised by it. You said to Senator Cornyn, this is about allocating resources.
Yeah.
What resources are we allocating? If one of your assistant U.S. attorneys has some criminal lowlife who could be charged with 12 offenses, but they don't charge the two most serious readily provable offenses because of your memorandum, they're still charged with 10 offenses. They have to go to a grand jury. They have to go to trial. They have to have a pre-sentencing report. They have to have a sentencing hearing. How is that conserving resources that you don't charge them with the most serious readily provable offenses that would lock these lowlifes up for the longest time possible?
Lowlifes that you're worried about and have expressed worried about, the large drug traffickers, the violent criminals, they are to be charged to the max.
I ask again, what resources were you talking about? You said to Senator Cornyn specifically it was about allocating resources. What resources?
These include our investigators and how much we have to investigate in order to establish the requirements for mandatory minimums. The prosecutors have to prove those cases, the judges who have to try those cases, and the jails that have to hold those cases, those individuals for longer terms.
Jails are, I don't see how jails could be a problem. You only have 158,000 prisoners now. 10 years ago, it was 219,000. Do you need more prisons?
Well, I think that...
Kenny's an appropriator. I bet he could get you more prisons.
I think many of the senators have complained that the jails are too filled, that they're overcrowded, that we're not able to provide the level of protection and security for guards and for prisoners that we would like. But that is not what this is about. Again, I want to be clear. The memorandum was crystal clear that they are to charge the most serious provable offense in cases involving violent crime and drug trafficking.
Okay, let's turn to another example of you overriding Congress's will. Congress has repeatedly decided to impose stiffer penalties for crack cocaine than powder cocaine, done originally at the request of members of the Congressional Black Caucus, voted for by senators like Senator Durbin, the chairman of this committee. 10 years ago, they made change to that. They specifically kept the ratio higher, and they didn't make it retroactive. Now, you have directed your prosecutors, when they are dealing with crack cocaine, to charge it as if it was powder cocaine, something that this Congress has repeatedly refused to do, which we refused to do as recently as December when Senator Booker tried it on the floor and I blocked it. How do you explain overriding Congress's decision on this distinction between crack and powder cocaine to suit your own policy preferences?
The long-standing rule is that the Department of Justice uses its discretion in which charges to bring, regardless of which ones are available, which ones are to bring. Every bit of evidence we have is that there's no difference between powder and crack. Governor Hutchinson testified to that fact.
Those are legislative decisions. Those are not prosecutorial decisions. If this Congress wants to do it, maybe it will one day, and maybe I'll be outvoted. But those are legislative decisions. Those are not prosecutorial decisions. You said at your confirmation hearing that you had to follow the law as it was written, that the executive branch could not rewrite the law. What you were doing is rewriting the law. It's not a single prosecutor out on the front lines making one decision. You're directing every federal prosecutor to override the law that has been written by Congress.
We're using our discretion as to which charges to bring, in which circumstances, which ones are appropriate. That's what we're doing. That's a long-standing history of prosecutorial discretion in the United States.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, hello. Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Cotton, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Mayor, you acknowledge in your opening statement that the shift away from counterterrorism is the primary role of our nation's special operations forces. But far from decreasing the need for those forces, I'd suggest that the current threat environment calls for even more capability. They need to continue our counterterrorism missions, support foreign internal defense activities to bolster allies, and engage in new types of operations that are going to counter Chinese and Russian aggression. In that operating environment, would a decrease in force size or budget seem like a reasonable step to you?
So, Senator Cotton, thanks for the question. Yeah, this is the crux of the challenge, right? We're being asked to do more, and our force is probably static. So I would not advocate for a reduction in forces, sir.
I regret that you're here today and not 48 hours from now when we're going to get the President's budget, because I am troubled that you may, in fact, get a reduction in budget or forces. You have any thoughts on what we're going to see on Thursday?
Senator, as I think you know, I can't talk to what's likely to be in the budget, but I think, as General Fenton and I both said, the priorities that we have identified are represented in that budget, sir.
Okay. Well, if my fears are proven out, I think you can count on many members of this committee, probably in both parties, to try to make sure that our Special Operations Forces have the resources they need. General Fenton, do you agree that SOCOM's requirements and your relevance are growing in this threat environment, not decreasing?
Senator, I would agree with that. I think the SOCOM requirements to be in campaigning and competition are absolutely important and exceedingly asked for by combatant command teams, where I draw my requirements from, certainly in line with their Theater Special Ops Command, the TSOCs. But we see it because much of this begins with partnerships that we forge through the SOCOM team and enable. And the payoff in many ways can be looked at in the vicinity of Ukraine.
So a decrease in either your budget or your personnel levels would add risk to your mission and therefore to our nation?
Well, Senator, no one wants to see a decrease in personnel or the budget. I would tell you that I think it would not reflect the requirements, number one, a decrease of that. And number two, we would be forced at some point to make hard choices, because each and every time I think you'll see me give you the best Special Operations Command for the budget we get.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, when we're talking about your personnel, I want to return to something else you had in your opening statement, because I want to make sure we're using this personnel budget the right way. You talked about the need for more staff. I got to tell you, that gets my hackles up pretty quickly. I think we have plenty of staff in the Pentagon, way too much. Frankly, I think we have too many people dressed like you and me and not enough people dressed like the men to your right and your left performing these jobs. Could you explain a little bit more about what kind of staff you're talking about and why you would need more staff?
So, Senator, I was referring specifically to the Special Operations Low-Intensity Conflict staff that performs the Title 10 responsibility of the organized, train, equip for SOCOM. So frankly, sir, a lot of what these staff do on a daily basis is try to articulate the soft value proposition back into the department with the services. Some of my concern is that as we go from the less intense environment of counterterrorism, or go towards a less intense environment without the intense focus on counterterrorism, that some of what SOF has traditionally been afforded will be lost in that. So, sir, sometimes this is just as simple as making sure that we have the SOF value proposition represented in resourcing, training, planning. I've been frankly surprised at times of how that has been forgotten or too narrowly defined as being a counterterrorism problem. So, you know, my 40-some-odd staff are very much in that business, and you know, it's the analytics, it's supporting special programs, other things like that that are very, I think, akin to the soft value proposition, but don't have representation often within the broader department, sir.
Okay. General Fenton, one final question. In your opening statement, you talked about the strategic transition for the Special Operation Forces. Could you explain a little more about the role that your forces, Special Operations Forces, are going to be expected to play in the future fight? And if so, if you can, at an unclassified level, maybe help share that story?
Senator, thank you for that. I'll focus on integrated deterrents and where the Secretary and the Department have asked us to be aligned. And when I think about that, I think about it along three lenses: prevent, prepare, and then prevail. I think on the prevention side, it's all about being forward. It's about being deployed. Our skills, cultural understanding, language, and a familiarity with many of these environments that come from organizations in our enterprise that know those places well, such as our 1st Special Forces Group in Indo-Pacific, for instance, have a very deep familiarity with all things that go on in many of the partner nations. I think it's key to keep that certainly thick and strengthened. So part of it is being out, training, advising, assisting, building capabilities, and using many of the tools this committee gives us in the form of security cooperation, 1202, and counterterrorism tools. That's a very key part. I think it also allows us an opportunity to help the joint force and enable them as we're out in those environments and are able to prepare through our understanding of everything from seabed all the way to space domain, and then work in concert with General Nakasone and Jim Dickinson and a soft space cyber triad. I think those are all very important. There is an acceleration towards that. It began before, certainly under General Rich Clark, and we're accelerating that in the Special Operations Team, while we stay vigilant on the counterterrorism mission and certainly our crisis response duties as directed by the Secretary.
Thank you, gentlemen. Director Haynes, I want to turn to a concern I've raised with you and Director Byrne and others, and that's my worries about growing politicization and the analysis coming out of our intelligence agency. This is an annual threat assessment. There is an annual threat assessment, so let's look at it. On page 33, you write, transnational, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists continue to pose the most lethal threat to U.S. persons and interests. Are you serious? You seriously think that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are the most lethal threat that Americans face?
So, yes, sir. In terms of the number of people killed or wounded as a consequence.
How many people were killed by racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists in the United States last year?
I don't have the exact number for you right here, but I will get it for you.
How many people were killed by fentanyl in the United States last year?
As you know, it's over 100,000 for fentanyl. But
so isn't that a more lethal threat?
Absolutely, but it's not being compared against fentanyl in that statement. It's in the context of terrorist threat.
Okay, so on page 38, you write about governance challenges in Europe. You talk about populist parties taking advantage of inflation and high energy prices. You worry that public discontent, potentially including increased mass protests, could undermine backing from mainstream European governments while increasing support for populist and extreme parties. You also say it could undermine the quality of democracy. Well, how is this foreign intelligence? And who are these populist parties in Europe that we're so concerned about?
So we can get you further information about this, but I'll just say as a general matter, Senator, we do cover different effects on democracy throughout the world, and that is something that is typically perceived as part of our remit.
Are the Brothers of Italy, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's party, are they a populist or extreme party that are a threat to America's interests?
I don't know that, I wouldn't want to speak for the analysts as to whether or not they consider them a populist party. I suspect that they may, but I don't know that they would say that they're a threat to to the United States.
All right, just one final example of this. On page 18 about nuclear issues with Iran, you write that since the assassination in November 2020 of nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iran has accelerated the expansion of its nuclear program. It's an unfortunate ending for Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November of 2020. Did anything else happen in the world in November of 2020 that might have caused Iran to accelerate its nuclear program?
Senator, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Pretty big event here in America. November 2020.
If you mean the election,
I do mean the
I
election.
don't believe that our analysts perceive that as being the key.
Really, because I've gone through the IAEA reports. Iran took almost a year almost a year after President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, until the summer of 2019 to say it was going to incrementally begin to breach its limits. After we killed Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, they basically ceased all enrichment or other activity. And since November of 2020, they've reintroduced advanced centrifuges. They began enriching uranium past the critical 3.67% mark. They produce uranium metal. They've moved enrichment underground. They're now enriching to almost 90%. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl said to the House recently that they're just 12 days away from a breakout, implying that all happened on the former administration's watch. This has all happened since November of 2020, Director Haynes. And your report says nothing about the Biden administration's policies. You really don't think the Ayatollahs had any change of views once it was clear Joe Biden was going to be president?
I think our analysts would look at leaving the JCPOA as one element that's relevant to the,
All right, so my time has expired. I'll say, Director Burns, we've talked about this in a classified setting before. I mean, your organization produces the vast majority of the analysis for the IC, and it's not just the conclusions, but also the priorities and the volume of focus on things like climate change or gay marriage bills in other countries, or some of these conclusions that just caused me great pause about the priorities and the resources we're applying to the critical threats this country face. We talk more about it in a classified setting.
Okay. Senator Cotton.
Thank you. I want to return to the issue I addressed at first, which is politicization of analysis and resources. And that can happen by altering conclusions to fit a party line, but can also happen, as I stressed, in priorities and focus and resources. So, Director Haynes, I want to return again to page 33 of the threat assessment, where you write, transnational, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists continue to pose the most lethal threat to U.S. persons and interests. I just found that astonishing. I compared it to fentanyl, and you said you mean that in the context of terrorism, correct? So you'll agree with me that fentanyl is a more lethal threat to Americans than racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists?
Yes, absolutely.
But in the context of terrorism, your conclusion is that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are a more lethal threat to Americans than ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah?
Thank you. Yes, what we say in the piece, and it's under the category, essentially, so of global terrorism, right? So it goes through the different areas of global terrorism, including transnationally, racially, and ethnically motivated violent extremism. The fact that it is the most lethal threat for with respect to U.S. persons is something that we actually stated, I think, over 2 years ago in another report as well that similarly laid out these different issues. And it simply is a question of how many people, how many U.S. persons are killed or wounded as a consequence of attacks.
Director Burns, do you agree that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are a more lethal threat to Americans than ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
Well, I agree with Senator, with what Director Haynes just said, that if you measure this in terms of American lives lost or people who were wounded, I think those statistics bear that out. I mean, we obviously take extremely seriously the threat posed by groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Hezbollah as well. That's our job as a foreign intelligence service as well.
I find this astonishing.
The threat. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Cotton, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. Welcome back. General Cotton, I can't remember if we've addressed this before at your confirmation hearing, but I've addressed it with a lot of your predecessors, so I want to raise it with you again. Sometimes we hear criticism about our nuclear forces along the lines of that we shouldn't spend so much money on weapons that we never use. I sometimes point out that we don't actually spend that much money on our nuclear forces in the grand scheme of our defense budget. We do happen to be going through a somewhat expensive modernization right now, but in general, it's in the low single percentiles. I also point out that we actually do use our nuclear weapons. We've used them every single day since August of 1945 to deter the kind of war that we had from 1939 to 1945. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree with that, Senator.
That every single day our nuclear weapons deter our adversaries, not just from nuclear warfare, but from the kind of conventional warfare that we saw so often in the first half, even in some cases at a lower intensity level, the second half of the 20th century.
I do agree.
So we have to have a credible nuclear deterrent to achieve those continued effects. Right now we have one nuclear arms control treaty in effect, the New START treaty. However, Russia has recently suspended its cooperation with that treaty. Is that right?
They have suspended, yes, sir.
What do you think are the prospects for Russia returning into compliance with that treaty, given their history of cheating on other treaties like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty?
I would hope that they would come back and try to get in compliance, but hope is not a plan.
Right. So over time, there's really no way to know if they're actually complying with the limits on warheads or delivery systems under that treaty.
That's correct.
I also want to talk a little bit about Russia's nuclear forces that are sometimes known as tactical nukes or non-strategic nukes or low-yield nukes, to whatever you want to call it. To put it simply, smaller nuclear warheads, maybe something akin to what we used in World War II, as opposed to 4 megaton city killers. Is that a fair characterization?
That's correct. And to define it, non-nuclear strategic weapons are defined as any weapon that is not under the New START treaty.
Exactly.
And that's about 2,000 weapons.
So all these weapons, whatever their yield, are not covered by the New START treaty and therefore not covered by any treaty. Correct?
That is correct.
Do you want to say how many of those kinds of weapons we have? If you don't want to in this setting, that's fine.
We can talk about that in a closed session, sir.
I think we have a little bit fewer than 2,000 is the way I'd put it. And you might say, well, we have 4 megaton city killers. What do we need it? So the logic here is that if all you have are giant city killers and your adversary has thousands of smaller nuclear weapons, they might believe that they can detonate one of those smaller weapons and you won't retaliate because you're not going to trade a 4 megaton city killer with a nuclear weapon that took an artillery battalion off the battlefield. Is that right?
There's a potential for that, exactly.
Yeah. And Russia's totally unconstrained in building those and using them if they choose under arms control treaties. How many arms control treaties do we have with communist China?
0. Sir.
0. So China's not constrained at all in building every kind of nuclear weapon it wants, and in fact it is on a crash course, especially in building missile fields in China. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What do you think China's appetite is to enter some nuclear arms control agreement, say like the New START treaty?
I would hope they would want to come to the table, but my first comment stands.
They haven't, so hope is not a strategy, and they haven't manifested much desire to come to the table. Even if they did, do you think China would ever accept an arms control agreement that left them with fewer warheads and delivery systems than either Russia or the United States had?
Now that I couldn't answer.
I mean, if I were the leader of China, I don't think I'd accept that. And if you did assume that, let's say China accepted some constraint like the New START treaty, that would mean by definition that China and Russia together had significant overmatch against the United States in warheads and delivery systems. So I just think that the idea that we are restraining ourselves from building the nuclear forces that we need to deter both Russia and China is a height of folly. I know you're not responsible for that, but I think your answers here have illuminated. General Dixon, I want to turn to you. I have a question about the commercial integration cell. I think as a security environment has grown more complex, it's necessary for our military to work with partners to share information, partners in industry to share information and collaborate on new capabilities. You've led the way with your commercial integration cell. Could you just discuss the status of that cell and the successes you've had and the lessons you've learned that we might build upon, especially in the other combatant commands?
Senator, that is a bright spot within the command. Over the last 3.5 years, we've taken our relationships with the commercial industry and have expanded it. We've actually had such a bow wave, if you will, of commercial companies wanting to come participate with us and be part of the team. We've actually had to rewrite our strategy so we would have the appropriate framework in order to onboard commercial companies that want to be part of the command. They perform 2 primary functions within the command from a commercial perspective. One is satellite communications and the other one is space domain awareness. And so currently, we've got 10 partners, commercial partners out at Vandenberg Space Force Base, traditional SATCOM type of capabilities that they provide to us. In Colorado Springs, we have what we call the Joint Task Force Space Defense Commercial Operations Cell. They are a group of contractors that provide space domain awareness, telescopes, if you will, radars that can look into space and report back to us what they see. And that's actually been a very promising enterprise there as we continue to grow that. That is actually where we've actually had a lot of growth with our allies and partners. And so our allies and partners around the world want to participate in that particular space domain awareness function. And what's good about that particular capability is it's unclassified. So our obstacles to classification barriers, et cetera, we don't see that with that particular cell. And it's growing. We're getting more and more partners into allies and partners as well as commercial companies. And we actually exercise that capability during an exercise we call Global Sentinel, which actually has 24 of our partners and allies around the world that participate in that. And we go through various scenarios on space debris mitigation. But it is growing, and we've got interest in the allies and partners to participate and contribute more to it.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, thank you both for your service, and thanks to you and all the troops who serve in your commands. What you do is deadly serious business. Mr. Secretary, I want to return to the issue of the strikes in Syria last week and Senator Wicker's line of questioning about the timing of notification to Congress. You said that you, quote, should have notified Congress earlier. These attacks happened against our troops, killing one contractor early in the morning Eastern time. Do you believe that you should have notified us that morning while we were voting on amendments directly related to this kind of attack?
Again, there is no connection between when we notified you, Senator, and your vote. The chairman and I were testifying that morning as well. So as soon as we came out of testimony, we began work on crafting response options. So.
Secretary Austin, I don't believe you. I believe that your office specifically withheld notification of this deadly strike against Americans because the Rubio Amendment, on which we voted midday, directly touched on exactly this scenario, not repealing these use of force resolutions if the president couldn't certify that Iran was no longer attacking us in Iran and Syria. That's what I believe. Nothing you can say is going to change my belief about that. And I got to say, I think I speak for about a lot of my colleagues.
I just want to say, Senator, that that is absolutely not true.
Maybe you didn't personally do it. Maybe you didn't personally do it. But I believe entirely that people in your office did that. You have a vast legislative operation, as Senator Wicker pointed out. Do you really expect us to believe that they didn't know that we were voting on a Rubio amendment that directly covered exactly this kind of attack? I don't believe that. I don't believe it. I believe there's a conscious decision made not to inform Congress because you fear that it might lead to the passage of the Rubio amendment, which would kill the entire bill. But I want to move on to a more important part, which is these attacks in the first place. How many attacks has Iran or its proxies launched against American positions in Iran and Syria since Joe Biden took office?
There's been about 83 attacks, I think, since in the last several years.
That's a lot of attacks over 2 years. How many times have we retaliated against Iran or its proxies?
We've launched 4 major strikes, Senator, but an attack can consist of a number of things. It can consist of, a rocket that's fired in the direction of one of our bases, but not effective.
Mr. Secretary, I'm well aware of what an attack could entail. So 79 and 4 is Iran's record right now. And our 4 attacks have not been against Iran, right? They've been against Iran's proxies in Iraq or Syria or elsewhere. Is that correct?
This last attack was against IRGC Quds Force infrastructure. And
okay. And after we retaliated, Iran attacked us again, injuring another American, didn't it?
They did.
And have we retaliated for that attack on Friday?
We have not yet, Senator.
So what kind of signal do we think this sends to Iran when they can attack us 83 times since Joe Biden has become president and we only respond 4? Maybe it's because they know that that we will not retaliate until they kill an American, which emboldens them to keep launching these attacks which kill Americans. What is our rules of engagement for on-the-ground commanders throughout the region? Are they allowed to engage immediately if their position has been attacked?
They can, and they do. and there have been several instances of that, Senator.
I've got to say, I've heard from company and field grade commanders who've been in the region very recently, and they say there's a lot of confusion over that. Let me move to a related topic, and that's our operations of unmanned aircraft in the Black Sea. Russia downed one of our Reaper aircraft a couple of weeks ago. Have we flown those aircrafts into the exact same space since it was downed?
We have flown on the paths that we want to fly in the Black Sea to collect intelligence information.
So that is that's far from a yes answer. I said, have we flown in the same airspace? You've said we've flown in the paths we want to fly to collect intelligence. So have we adjusted our flight patterns? Have we moved down to that airspace?
We will fly the paths that we feel necessary to collect intelligence information.
So according to an administration official from an article in CNN on March 21st, we're not flying in that airspace to, quote, to avoid being too provocative. So are we removing our aircraft out of the space from which that Reaper flew because we don't want to be too provocative towards Russia?
Senator, you may have heard me say immediately after this incident that I told my counterpart that we're going to fly the skies, the international skies, and sail the seas as we wish. And so we continue to fly in that airspace.
In the exact same airspace where that Reaper was downed?
Again,
you haven't pulled back from Crimea or from the Ukrainian or the Russian coasts?
I recommend we take this to a closed
We can. I think it answers the question, though, and it gets to the point I'm trying to make here. We continue to deter ourselves against our adversaries. We let Iran launch 83 attacks against us. We only respond 4 times. Russia downs one of our aircraft, and we pull back from that airspace, just like we've been delaying ballistic missile tests over the last 2 years, or over the last year, just like we let a Chinese spy balloon float across the country when we could have downed it across the Aleutians. Now, I don't necessarily think these are Secretary of Defense calls. I think these are Commander-in-Chief calls. But we shouldn't be surprised when our adversaries get emboldened and more aggressive in all these theaters when we continue to deter ourselves.
Senator Cotton.
Secretary Mayorkas, the Uyghur people are a religious and ethnic minority in northwest China. Your administration and the last administration have both concluded that the Chinese government is committing genocide against this people. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do, and it's why we are so vigorously enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Well, thank you for the candid answer on that. That's much better than, for instance, the TikTok CEO could give last week about the genocide against this people. Part of Congress's reaction, as you suggested, was in 2021 passing a bill that I and many others sponsored. In fact, I think it was a majority of senators, known as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It passed the Senate unanimously, so I know that you're familiar with it. The law requires Customs and Border Protection at DHS to presume that materials sourced from that province are produced by forced labor because of the widespread usage of forced labor in the province among the suppressed people. It bars those products from importation into the United States. And under that law, every textile manufacturer has to certify that their imported materials aren't sourced from Xinjiang province in China. It's come to my attention that a veteran-owned company called 9 Line Apparel, which prides itself on ethically sourced products, recently decided to trust but verify their suppliers' certifications that the cotton they were using originated in Central America rather than in China. So they had their supposedly clean textile imports professionally tested. It turned out that slave-produced fabric from China was mixed in and passed off as Central American cotton. 9 Line Apparel did the right thing and got rid of all that material, and they reported it to Customs and Border Protection, offering to give them all the evidence they needed from their professional testing facility. But unfortunately, CBP decided not to follow up. They directed 9 Line Apparel to submit a complaint to a generic email box, which was not replied to. When 9 Line Apparel CEO then followed up by calling CBP directly, CBP told him that enforcing this act's ban on slave-produced textiles and other fabric is not one of their top priorities. Mr. Secretary, is enforcing the federal ban on slave-produced products and materials from China a top priority for your department?
It most certainly is.
Why would CBP have told the CEO of Nine Line Apparel that this is not a top priority.
That is not a reflection of our prioritization of this work, nor is it consistent with our prioritization of this work. And I must say that the Act is an incredibly important statute that Congress passed, and I appreciate your leadership in achieving it. It is something that we enforce very, very vigorously and need to do so. And I should say that the Act provides that it pertains to materials produced in whole or in part with forced labor. And I cite that because that is very important language, because we do not countenance at all the use of forced labor by the PRC. And we cannot allow materials into the United States that are in violation of the statute.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Mr. Secretary. I think it's important that we heard that here in public for everyone in CBP to hear that their secretary believes that the enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a top priority, correct?
Oh, yes, and let me assure you that the personnel of CBP are in perfect lockstep with me.
Well, I know that sometimes in bureaucracies, messages don't always get transmitted as clearly as leaders might like, so I'm glad that we have you saying that clearly today. I would also like to be able to follow up with you and your team in the next couple weeks about this specific case of Nine Line Apparel and see what might have happened in that matter.
I look forward to doing so.
Second, I want to turn to TikTok. We've had a lot of talk about fentanyl today, rightly so, given the surge in drug deaths in this country. TikTok has sometimes been referred to as digital fentanyl. You may have seen last week that the CEO of TikTok testified, and he tried to pass off this Chinese communist spying app as safe because it had a, quote, U.S.-based team who oversees the massive amounts of Americans' data that TikTok vacuums up. So I want to talk about those U.S.-based employees. Last year, your department approved more than 700 applications for foreign nationals to work at TikTok and ByteDance's offices in California. Do you happen to recall how many of those 700 were Chinese nationals?
Let me assure you, Senator, that we are very focused on the threat that TikTok presents, and we are very, very focused on the threat that the PRC presents.
So I'll come to that general threat in a moment. I'm just
number of different areas.
Do you recall how many of those 700 foreign nationals that were approved to work at TikTok and ByteDance's California offices were Chinese nationals?
Senator, I would be very pleased to look into that.
There's 445. It doesn't sound like a U.S.-based team to me, despite whatever Xiao Chu, the CEO of TikTok, said last week, if they're predominantly Chinese nationals. Do you think employees coming to work at ByteDance and TikTok in the United States might be tied to the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Liberation Army?
Senator, that is indeed a concern of ours, and we are working to ensure that the visa screening process is as robust and vigilant as it needs to be.
Okay,
let me share also that, of course, the TikTok transaction is something that is under a review and is the subject of litigation. We are very, very focused on the peril that TikTok presents.
I understand. I think TikTok should have been banned a long time ago. I would point out that last week, as the administration floated this plan, so-called Project Texas, which I think is deeply misguided, and the sale of TikTok, China's government said they would never allow that to happen, which contradicts everything TikTok has ever said about not being beholden to the Chinese government. But I want to come back to your department. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, reports to you. They call themselves America's Cyber Defense Agency. I looked on their website recently. As far as I can tell, though, CISA has never issued a warning about TikTok other than to recommend people update the TikTok app to fix software bugs. I got to say, I'm less concerned about bugs in TikTok than I am about features in TikTok. And the features of TikTok is it's designed to vacuum up every bit of data on an American's phone, not just their videos from the app itself, but their contacts, their emails, their text messages, their photos, perhaps even activate their microphones and their cameras remotely. So has CISA ever issued a warning to the American people about TikTok? other than updating the software to avoid bugs?
Senator CISA's focus is indeed on cybersecurity. We are a member of the Committee for Foreign Investments in the United States, CFIUS, of which you are very familiar. And we, and across the administration, are focused on the TikTok challenge more broadly.
Well, I would encourage you and CISA to take a more or to take a closer look at this and make it more prominent on the website. I think many Americans still don't understand why so many of their elected officials are so hostile to TikTok. Even that hearing last week when Democrats and Republicans alike excoriated the disgraceful performance of Xiao Chu, the TikTok CEO, they're still wondering why their elected officials are still worried about their privacy and their security. Let's turn to Mr. Chu. Do you know what nationality Xiao Chu is?
I do not, Senator.
It's hard to find out on the internet what he is. He's often referred to as a Singaporean. He spent a lot of time in America, though, if you look at his resume. I assume that he's not an American citizen, because if he was, I'm pretty sure TikTok would refer to him as our American CEO, as they did his short-term predecessor.
Senator, just a number of months ago, I was in Singapore, and to address in the Indo-Pacific region the threat that the PRC presents. When countries accept their loans, there's no free lunch, as I articulated in my remarks, and how precarious it is to allow the PRC to actually build and own the infrastructure upon which many of these countries rely.
Well, I appreciate that. I just want to have a few concluding thoughts with Mr. Chu, who seems to me like a Communist Party stooge, an agent of communist influence in America. You know, he wouldn't admit what you admitted very quickly and highlighted the importance of, that China is committing a genocide against its own people. In fact, I think he was asked once if TikTok spies on Americans, and his answer was that, well, he wouldn't use the word spying as exactly the right word. So the Immigration and Nationality Act makes any alien deportable if they, quote, engage in any activity to violate any law of the United States relating to espionage or sabotage or a few other things. Seems to me that Mr. Chu is a foreign national in the United States representing essentially an arm or an agency of the Chinese Communist Party, as they acknowledged last week. He shouldn't be allowed to stay in the United States, and he certainly shouldn't be invited back in. I don't think we need agents of Chinese communist influence in our country, especially coming to spread their lies in the United States Congress. See, my time has expired. I look forward to following up with you on the Forced Labor Act matter, and thank you for clarifying that for all of your CBP officers around the country.
Thank you, Senator.
I call on myself for 10 minutes. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I would ask for unanimous consent to, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Rhodes. Senator Cotton, please.
On behalf of all Arkansans, I also want to express my condolences for the soldiers whose lives were lost in the crash of 2 Black Hawk helicopters near Fort Campbell overnight. It's a terrible tragedy for all their families and the 101st community. And if you've served time there, as I know General McConville has served more than a day or two at Fort Campbell, it's especially hard-hitting. And General McConville, I want to add my thanks and congratulations to you for a highly distinguished and decorated career of service to the Army. I know you're not retiring yet, and you'll run through the tape later this year, but we're very grateful for what you've done for our country, and we're glad that in the middle of a recruiting crisis, we're getting a 4-for-1 McConville trade. We may be losing you, but we've got 3 children and 1 in-law, so thank you and your family for your service. Secretary Wormuth, I want to talk about the Army Combat Fitness Test and this ongoing years-long saga of that. Last year, the Army unveiled gender-based standards after many years of promising gender-neutral standards. As a result, this committee directed the Army within 180 days of the enactment of last year's NDA to promulgate new gender-neutral standards for combat arms, MOSs. What is the status of those new standards?
Thank you, Senator. We're looking forward to coming to brief you in June about where we are on that NDAA requirement. And I know you and the chief had a discussion about this. The language in the bill, as you know, talks about gender-neutral standards for combat military occupational specialties, and we'll be able to lay out for you how we've approached that to date. We also, as you know, are coming up on the deadline for the active duty component to finish taking the test for record, the Army Combat Fitness Test. The Guard and Reserve folks have until October to take that test for record, but we can also give you an update on the data that we're seeing from that and what we can take away from that and what we can learn in terms of how we might adapt the ACFT going forward.
So the law called on the Army to establish the standards by June, not to brief Congress by June. Are you prepared to meet that requirement to establish the standards?
We actually have standards in a DA-PAM that lay out requirements for all of the combat MOSs that are gender neutral, and we can brief you on those.
Can you tell us what those combat MOSs are today, or what branches at least?
I believe that we have them for all of the MOSs, Senator.
Okay. But it's your understanding that the expectation of this committee is that we have a single standard for the combat arms branches, and then for all the other non-combat arms branches, there be a male and a female standard?
These are, as I have read the law that you all put in last year, these are standards, they're physical, gender-neutral standards for combat military occupational specialties, yes.
Yes, because I mean, and I wasn't the only one. I mean, Senators Ernst and Gillibrand and Duckworth expressed concerns about this as well, as did most of the committee. I mean, when you're talking about things like the infantry, there's irreducible physical demands. You have to be able to carry a 75 or 100-pound pack or carry a 250-pound wounded comrade, whether you're a man or a woman. Or if you're in artillery or armor, you have to be able to handle shells that can weigh up to 100 pounds. Those standards, we all think, should be somewhat different if you're, say, working on a computer. That work is very vital, but it's not the same kind of physical demands that the combat arms are. And in the middle of a recruiting crisis, I don't think we should be taking steps to dissuade anyone, young men or young women, who may not be up to the physical rigors of armor and artillery, but are able to perform all those other roles. That's your understanding of what this Congress intended, right?
Senator, the DA-PAM spells out exactly those kinds of things. I think the issue has been, you know, there's our combat, there's the fitness test, and then there are the standards for the MOSs, and there's a distinction there.
Correct. I mean, this has been a long saga, as I said. In retrospect, I mean, you know, we had an army that, let's see, toppled a Marxist government in Grenada, toppled a narco government in Panama, kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, toppled the Taliban, toppled Saddam Hussein doing push-up, sit-ups, and 2-mile run. So I think those guys were pretty physically fit that did all those things. But we are where we are. We've moved to the combat fitness test. I don't think the issue are the events on it. The issue is making sure that we have high standards that are suited for the demands of the battlefield. And we just want to make sure that that's what we're going to get from the Army by the 180-day deadline.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you for your service to the country. I add my sentiment to those who have expressed just sorrow over the incident with the...
Senator King and Senator Cotton, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Gilday and General Berger, thank you for your latest and presumptively your last appearance at the committee as Chief and Commandant. We congratulate you for a lifetime of service and appreciate everything you've done for this country. Mr. Secretary, I want to be the latest senator asked about this issue of the 31 amphibs. The budget this year doesn't include any FY24 money for the 17th San Antonio class ship. That sets you on a path to fall below the legislatively mandated 31 ship amphib floor, as Senator Kane pointed out. And General Berger, you testified that you think that's in the needs of the Marine Corps. So I just want to ask, what's up with this discrepancy between that legislative mandate and General Berger's stated needs for the Marine Corps and the budget request? Can you explain it to us?
Well, thank you, Senator. First, let me unequivocally state that I don't dismiss anything that the Commandant of the Marine Corps said with the need for our nation to have the heavy lift that's necessary to provide our expeditionary forces in the Pacific, in particular, the ships that they need to be able to carry equipment and personnel around the Pacific. The concern that developed over the course of the last year or so has been the increasing cost of the platforms themselves. There were two studies that were done to address this issue. One is a cost study that was initiated by the Office of Secretary of Defense to look at and compare the cost essentially between the different designs of the LPD and see if we could actually bring down those costs. And the second is the BIFSAR, which is mandated by the 23 NDAA as well, and to take a look at the overall requirements for the amphibious ships, both large and medium, in order to make the right decisions necessary in the 25 budget to invest in the required platforms. And I think that there's also general recognition that moving towards a multi-ship, multi-year procurement is an effective way to bring the cost of those ships down in the future.
So at bottom, it's a cost issue.
Yes, sir. The cost per ship issue.
Yes. General Berger, any further thoughts on this matter?
The Senate, the Congress gave the service chief the authority, the responsibility to determine the operational requirement, which I did, which is 31. But the Secretary obviously has a lot of things he has to fund, as does the Secretary of Defense. So I'm not in their position to weigh it against all the other things that they must fund. I can just tell you that the operational requirement, the minimum, is 31. And that assumes a level of maintenance that provides the availability to combatant commanders.
Okay, thank you both. Obviously, this matter has a high degree of interest on the committee, and I suspect we'll be addressing it in the months ahead. Mr. Secretary, I also want to speak about the state of our industrial base, especially what it means for submarines, the Navy's inability to field ships and the fleet on time and on budget for many years, well before you came along, to be fair.
Trying to make it better, Senator.
Yeah, we all are. But it's been a source of growing concern. There are press reports that it's now going to take 5 years for the Virginia-class submarine production to reach its target of 2 boats per year. Admiral Gilday earlier this year spoke to industry, and he told them that they needed to prove it. That's a direct quote. I think that's an apt quote to industry regarding the ability to ramp up production. Our submarines obviously provide us an unmatched strategic advantage, especially in the Western Pacific against communist China. So could you give us some thoughts about what we can do in this committee and in Congress to help assist with the ramp up of the industrial base, and especially as it relates to submarines?
Yes, sir. Again, it's all hands on deck approach. Everything from trying to improve the manpower issue and trying to get the shipyards to be able to recruit more effectively. I mean, we face across the entire country a national shortage when it comes to blue collar workers. I think increasing legal immigration to this country and work visa programs actually may very well help to better and support that blue-collar workforce that's needed in places like the shipyards, for example. But again, the investments that you've made in 23 and 24 are in the right direction in terms of the investments in the industrial base itself. One thing that I've been trying to do, Senator, is trying to expand the marketplace with regards to smaller shipyards, getting them involved in Department of Defense construction, and having them actually support the big primes. So I've been having conversation with the primes, for example, to try to include more smaller shipyards to feed the primes. And a perfect example of that actually is being executed now at Austal, where even before I got here, the CNO encouraged the development of steel hulls at Austal. They are now building steel hulls, and they're actually contributing to Electric Boat up in Connecticut and providing the necessary modules necessary. And I think HII is doing the same thing as is Ingalls down in Pensacola as well, too. I think continued investment in CapEx makes a lot of sense, where the government invests in these capital improvement programs at the shipyards so that the shipyards can also make an equal investment and help get us to the right place. It's all hands on deck across the entire spectrum of improvements that have to be made.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Rosen, please.
Well, thank you, Chairman Reed.
I want to return to what I said in my opening statement and commend you for your work to try to accelerate timelines for production of munitions. I know you and a lot of others have really been rolling up your sleeves and working long hours, but I think you'd agree that we're still not producing enough of what we need fast enough. That's both in our Army ammunition plants and the industrial base. I've dug into the tables behind the budget request, it's a shocking timeline, really, in some of these cases. Basic munitions, not ones that are complicated or advanced, like artillery shells can take up to 2 to 3 years to produce. Can you just give us a general sense of why that is? I mean, we built the Pentagon in less time than it takes to make basic artillery shells today. So what's up with that?
So, Senator, the actual time, I believe the timelines reflected in the formal budget documents are, I guess I would say those are the traditional timelines that assume a lengthy contracting process, followed by, a staggered, sometimes slow on purpose to maintain level workload at the factory approach. So for conventional munitions, I can tell you that artillery shells, for example, it takes about a month to get the steel. Now there's always a flow of steel, but about a month to get the steel. That steel is only at Scranton Army Ammunition Plant for about 3 days. Then it goes to Iowa Army Ammunition Plant for load assemble pack, which also only takes about a week. So when we're going as fast as we can, like we are right now, those timelines can be faster. However, sir, right now, as you mentioned, the issue is capacity, not timeline. On precision munitions, your point is very well taken and still very much the case. So advanced munitions, Patriots, sometimes even Gimlers, things with seekers or advanced electronics, we are still, sir, in those, at times, 1 to 2 year timelines, but trying to go faster right now.
So thank you for that, and I probably want to continue that distinction. And another distinction I want to drill down on is what you said about contracting processes or timelines. I view those as bureaucratic constraints. Those are Gordian knots. I think, in my opinion, Gordian knots exist to be cut. In many cases, a sword, or at least as Congress can be the sword. Then there's actual real-world constraints on the availability of certain inputs, whether it's steel, energetics, chips, what have you. Let's focus on that area first. What are the single worst bottlenecks we face in the real world constraints about these munitions? Because again, we're not talking about an aircraft carrier or stealth fighter. We're talking about in what are most cases are man-portable munitions. But what are the concrete real world bottlenecks that the Army is facing right now?
Yes, sir. So I think if we're talking about precision munitions, often it is the sensitive electronic components, so computer chips and everything behind them that leads to some of those timelines. So if you trace back to the original sources, that's where some of that comes from. Also, of course, our systems do have sophisticated systems to make them safer than what the Russians might produce or exportable. That also adds time. But most often it is the electronic components that take the most time, probably followed by solid rocket motors for a lot of our munitions that are rockets or missiles. The other elements or explosives and such really are the shorter holes in the tent.
Okay. And what are the best ways this committee and this Congress can provide the Army with ways to reduce those timelines, to open up those bottlenecks?
Yes, sir. So first of all, the most economically efficient way to make a production line better is to buy more. So that way you let the market do its thing, and it downstream suppliers get better. It helps the whole system. So that's number one. And thank you for your support on all of that. Number two, and thank you for the support last year, is multi-year techniques like multi-year procurement and advanced procurement. I think when we testified last year, we were exploring the ideas of doing those things for munitions. They hadn't been done before. We're doing them now. And making that normal, not an exception, will be vital, sir. So we have to get that right. One other leg in the stool would be, over time, working on continued, for example, Defense Production Act investments. So that is the tool the department has to go way down in the supply chain and directly invest in companies, often small ones at the third and fourth tier. Congress provided very generous additional DPA Title III funding last year. I think we're putting it to great work. I think we did it in the Cold War at a much larger scale, and I think that's a model for how, with the right authorities and the right money in the right place, we can be better prepared next time, sir. So
to be clear on that, you're not talking about up here at the primes or assembling things, but at the subcontractor or maybe even the subcontractor doing fairly kind of basic inputs, let's call them valves or gaskets or what have you, reaching down to that level with DPA authorities.
Yes, sir, and that's a big difference with DPA. So really our normal input is at the top with the prime, and you hope that funding flows down and goodness of a production line gets down to those suppliers. DPA lets us go directly at some of those subs, which are often actually the most weak points. It's not the bigs. It's the sub-tier contractors.
Yeah. And oftentimes those subcontractors, 1 or 2 levels down, are providing those inputs for multiple primes or multiple different weapon systems. So there's a bottleneck there as well, right?
Yes, sir. In many cases, and we've got this now, I think we've got a much better handle on mapping our own supply chains from the government side. We see those overlaps that industry might not see because they're looking at their supply chain, not the national supply chains.
One final question about inputs, drawing from a partner. Are you aware of NAMO's challenges in expanding in central Norway?
Not specifically, sir.
Now, their CEO said a couple of weeks ago that they would like to expand. Obviously, they're producing a lot of munitions that are in very high demand in Ukraine, but there is no electricity available in central Norway because all of the excess capacity is going to power servers for TikTok videos. He said they literally can't make more munition shells because of cat videos. Are you aware of any constraints on either our Army ammunition plants or in the defense industrial base because of electricity or other power inputs?
I'm not, sir. I believe we have other challenges. Some of I've mentioned and others, but I've definitely not heard that one. Not in the United States.
The NAMO CEO said he wouldn't have even put it past TikTok and the Chinese to specifically have cited their cat videos next to NAMO's production facility in central Norway. All right, I have more specific questions I'll save for a second round.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Rainey, on several occasions, this committee has
like the other members of the committee, I think there's little doubt that war crimes have been committed by Russians in Ukraine. I have to say, though, I think there's an element of putting the cart before the horse here. Before there can be accountability for these crimes, there has to be victory in the war. And we're not on the verge of victory in the war because Joe Biden has been pussyfooting for the last year, not providing Ukraine with the weapons that they need to win this war. In fact, not providing the weapons they need to defend the territory where some of these crimes have been committed before Ukraine took that territory back. So rather than continuing to say that we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, we should be focused on helping them win as quick as we can. Now, Ms. Monaco, I know you're not in charge of the conduct of our policy of the war, but rather on the crimes itself. But I just want to make that point, that until the war is won, there's very unlikely to be accountability for these crimes. I want to turn my attention to something for which you do have responsibility, though. There's a statute, a criminal statute, Section 1512, entitled Tampering with a Witness, Victim, or Informant. Most of that statute focuses on the altering, destruction, or hiding of records to be used in official proceeding. Ms. Monaco, are you aware of this statute?
Yes.
Do you know when it was adopted?
It was adopted, if memory serves, after the financial collapse of Enron and other corporate malfeasance.
In 2002, after the Enron scandal in a law called the Corporate Fraud and Accountability Act of 2002. It also includes a catch-all phrase prohibiting not just the destruction, hiding of evidence, but also any acts that, quote, otherwise obstruct, influence, or impede an official proceeding. The department is currently using that catch-all provision to prosecute hundreds of Americans for their actions on January 6, 2021 on the grounds of the United States Capitol. I want to be clear, I'm not talking here about persons who committed violent acts against law enforcement officers or destroyed property. There's plenty of federal crimes that cover their actions, but rather this catch-all phrase for people who in some cases were merely present on the Capitol grounds, maybe not even aware that that had been cordoned off earlier in the day. Are you aware of a case called U.S. v. Fisher in the D.C. Circuit, Ms. Monaco?
I'm not specifically familiar with the facts of it, but I think it's one of the cases brought in relation to the events at the Capitol.
Yeah, it was decided a couple weeks. It was decided a couple weeks ago on a sharply divided panel in which the department almost lost, in which there was a strong dispute on what that catch-all phrase meant about otherwise obstructing or influencing an official proceeding. And it allowed the case to go forward, but said that they have to prove corrupt intent. There's a strong dissent that said clearly the items in that law that precede the catch-all phrase, like destroying or concealing documents, should limit the meaning of otherwise obstructing or influencing a proceeding. I'm following the case closely. I wouldn't be surprised to see if the Supreme Court reverses it on review, or if the department can't prove the mental element of corrupt intent. Your Department of Justice argued, though, that corrupt, quote, encompasses all forms of obstructive and influencing behavior. That's a pretty sweeping interpretation of the law. Just this week, the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing in New York City, and it's been reported that a Democratic mob was in the hallway trying to get in through the doors and stop that hearing from proceeding. Has your department begun to investigate this effort to obstruct or influence the official proceeding of the House Judiciary Committee in New York City?
Senator, I'm not aware of those events, although I do know that that hearing took place. I'm not going to comment on, as you rightly pointed out, that statute and those cases, and indeed the Fisher case is one that is moving through the courts. I'm not going to comment on the application of it to those particular facts or more broadly, precisely because those are cases that are moving through the courts and are important cases.
Well, there's no case in New York moving through it. I'm simply asking if the Southern District of New York has stood up a task force to investigate all these people who corruptly influenced and obstructed proceeding of the House Judiciary Committee.
The men and women of the Justice Department that have been pursuing and bringing the cases of the events that occurred in the Capitol have been doing incredible work. This is the most far-reaching,
I didn't ask about that task force. I asked about a task force in New York. Let me ask you about another one. What about in Tennessee? A Democratic mob obstructed the Tennessee legislature recently to such a severe extent that the legislature expelled 2 of its members. Is the Department of Justice investigating all those protesters who disrupted the official proceeding of the Tennessee legislature?
I'm not aware of any such investigation, but I also wouldn't be able to comment on it if there was one.
You see where I'm going with this. Like Senator Lee said, there also your department directed marshals not to arrest Democratic mobs outside the homes of conservative Supreme Court justices, specifically directed them not to conduct any arrests, even though they were clearly violating the black letter of the law. There's no dispute that they were clearly violating the black letter of the law. In case after case after case, the department enforces the law against its political opponents and does not enforce the law against favored political interest groups.
Respectfully, Senator, the Attorney General is very clear. He directed the Marshal Service.
The Attorney General very clearly lied in that committee, as Senator Britt demonstrated later by the slides that she produced.
Respectfully, Senator,
the marshals
General
were directed not to arrest protesters outside of the homes. These were not criminal masterminds. They broadcast on social media when they were going to be violating the law, and there's not a single arrest, much less a prosecution. Meanwhile, you've stretched the meaning of a corporate document retention law to prosecute hundreds of people who were merely present on Capitol grounds on January 6, 2021.
Senator, would you like to respond?
I would like to respond, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. The Attorney General was forthright, was clear about the direction he gave to the U.S. Marshal Service. The Marshal Service Director was also clear that he has received that direction repeatedly. So I wanted to put that on the record. I also would like to point out that the men and women of the Justice Department who are investigating acts of violence, especially that occurred at the Capitol, are doing so at sometimes a great personal sacrifice and peril to themselves, and I'm proud to serve with them.
Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because there are some concerns.
Senator Cotton, please.
Admiral, I want to continue along the line of questioning about Taiwan's capabilities. I know that there's a backlog of weapons transfers to Taiwan that has to be addressed, but not every kind of weapon in the world is backlogged. So while we work on that backlog, I want your professional assessment on whether an appropriation of FMF funds to provide Taiwan with weapons that are not backlogged, weapons such as mines, might be helpful for them and also helpful to increase deterrence in the Western Pacific.
Yes, Senator. So the delivery capability to enable our responsibilities under the Taiwan Relations Act is important, and to get it to the people on Taiwan is critical. And the capabilities we've laid out that we've coordinated and identified inside the department, there are many that could be done very quickly.
And could you just give us kind of a handful of the top priorities of what additional FMF funds could get to Taiwan of weapons that are not backlogged?
I think what I give you is the capability set. I can't tell you which specific ones are
That's
backlogged.
fine.
But if you think about anti-aircraft capability, if you think about anti-ship capability in a variety of forms, whether they be missiles, mines, but those capabilities would be critical.
There's also the possibility of a Taiwan-focused presidential drawdown. Would your answer be the same for that? That also could help surge some of the capabilities of Taiwan that they need to improve deterrence in the Western Pacific, just like FMF funds would?
Yes, sir, absolutely. And I thank Congress for taking a look at that, and ultimately for the Presidential Drawdown Authority, not only for the authority to do it, but ultimately to backfill it if possible, is critical.
Okay. You've also expressed concern about the loss of any combat power in the theater. As the ranking member on the Air-Land Power Subcommittee, I've been particularly concerned about the fact that our Air Force is characterized by shrinking inventories and an aging fleet going back 30 years now. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about changing our global force posture. I know there's been a lot of angst, if you will, about moving aircraft around from the Western Pacific and from Germany and Alaska. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about adding more capability to the Air Force as a whole. Given the importance of air power in any kind of conflict scenario in the Western Pacific, would additional F-15EXs and F-35s in the Air Force inventory enhance your efforts to deter conflict?
That certainly would, Senator, especially when you talk about the increased capability and capacity that might come with that. Fifth generation, advanced, and the fourth generation capability that exists in the EX, those capabilities would absolutely help deliver deterrent effects.
Thank you. General, North Korea continues to develop new capabilities and make new threats to the Republic of Korea and to the United States and other friends. They recently tested a solid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile. How does that change your assessment of their capability, and why would that be an important advance for North Korea over their traditional liquid-fueled missiles?
No, thanks, Senator. It poses some challenges on the indications and warnings. Again, he laid out his plan. He's moving towards it. It's continuing to demonstrate a couple of things. One, he meant what he said, and two, he's continuing to be able to develop this capability, even with sanctions and even with COVID and lockdowns and things like that. He's been able to continue this development.
And why exactly does the introduction of a solid-fueled missile reduce your indications and warnings?
I'd rather move that to a classified setting. So.
Okay. I think sometimes we get kind of accustomed to these provocations from North Korea, and we overlook the fact that they are, in fact, improving their nuclear forces capability, and it's not just the same old, same old.
I can assure you I'm not distracted.
No, I know you're not, but I think some people here and when they see the news in the United States are, and I think it's important that we be mindful that they are making technological progress that is alarming in both the nature of their nuclear forces and also the ranges of their missiles. Thank you both, gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Aguilino, as we spoke about this morning, just want to get a little bit more detail on the Compass Call electronic warfare mission. You know, there is...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Cotton, please.
Thank you both for your service and your appearance today. General Cavoli, you testified earlier that 31 Abrams tanks would arrive in Ukraine later in the year. Estimates I've seen say that we're still about 8 months away from that. Is that correct?
No, Senator. The first thing we're going to do is put a training set in.
That starts next month in Grafenwöhr, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And then the next set, the dates are moving right now. We're trying to accelerate as much as we can. It'll probably
Are the same tanks at Grafenwöhr going to be the tanks that go to Ukraine?
The first set will not. Those will be training tanks that we keep, and then we'll send a different set in. We did the same thing with Bradleys earlier this year, sir.
Okay. General Van Ovost, have you received an order to transport that second set of tanks to Ukraine yet?
General Cotton and I work very closely with European Command to meet all of their requirements in a priority manner. Certainly, we are in coordination on the tanks as well as all the other significant equipment.
Is that a no?
We anticipate the movement, so from an order perspective, we're ready to move it.
Sounds like a no. General Cavoli, you look like you have something to say here.
My command has not issued a specific date for movement for those yet. As soon as we have the exact sourcing pinned down with the timeline, we will issue the actual order for the aircraft.
Why has your command not issued that order?
You know, can I take that for the record, Mr. Cotton? Because I'd like to give you the exact status of it.
I mean, our country has thousands of main battle tanks. It would seem like it's not that hard to find 31 and get them there.
Senator, some of the reasons for that I could cover in closed session, but if I could.
I guess, but I mean, I think the main reason for that is the main reasons why we didn't even agree to supply the tanks for a year, which is that President Biden didn't want to supply them. And again, I think we could supply them faster than 8 or 9 months if there was the political will. This is not a decision for you or General Van Ovost to make. I think it's just reflected from the political decision to continue to drag our feet in what we're supplying to Ukraine. It's just a repeated story we've seen over and over again throughout the course of this war. I want to get to one of the potential reasons for that as well. You talked earlier about submitting new O plans for NATO. It came to my attention earlier this year that we have not changed our O plans or our warfighting requirements in EUCOM for Russia. Is that correct?
Senator, I'm in consultation with the Secretary of Defense on that question right now. The question has been posed to me, and we're working our answer with the staff. I believe I have a date with the Secretary of Defense later this month or next month to discuss it in detail and to come to a conclusion on what timeline we will or will not adjust plans.
So that's a no then. Once again, that's a no. We haven't changed our requirements in the O plan to fight Russia.
Could we discuss exactly what we've done with O plans in closed session, sir?
Again, we can, but I think the question has been answered now. And the reason I highlighted is the committee is continuously told that by the administration, not by uniformed military officers, that we can't provide this, that, or the other weapon to Ukraine because we need it for our own requirements. I understand that, especially requirements in the Western Pacific against China. But if we still have the same requirements in place to fight Russia in April of 2023 that we had in February of 2022, after we've seen the performance of their military in Ukraine and after the known degradation of their military in Ukraine, then I think that's just a pretext that the administration is using for not supplying more capabilities to Ukraine. We can get into more detail in closed setting, but I think it's very troubling that the administration is still stuck in the pre-Ukraine war mindset of what it would take for us to adequately deter or defeat Russia in a conflict in EUCOM. One final point I want to raise is the flying of our MQ-9 drones in the Black Sea. Russia dangerously downed one a few weeks back. The reports I've seen and what I've heard from my sources is that we have now altered our flight patterns in the Black Sea, that we are no longer flying in the same airspace where we were flying before that negligent incident with the Russian aircraft. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator. So it was not just negligent; it was not competent. The Russian pilot bumped into the MQ-9, which is not something pilots typically do on purpose. Again, on ISR operations, especially in the Black Sea, I'd be delighted to answer you in detail in closed session.
Well, I asked the Secretary of Defense this recently, and he repeatedly said, we will fly the paths we feel necessary to collect intelligence information.
And those have been his instructions to me.
I understand that, but again, that's not a no when I was asking him that. To me, that's him saying we're not flying where we were anymore because we don't want to be provocative, which again is a political decision. It's not a military decision. And this is not some secret. I mean, Russia knows where we're flying these aircraft. Like anybody here could find out where we're flying them for the most part just by going on open source information. And the fact that If we were flying those aircraft in certain airspace in the Black Sea before that incident, because that's where we thought we needed to get intelligence, and now we're saying we can get that intelligence by flying them somewhere else where we shouldn't have been flying them there in the first place. But if we needed to get them there to get that intelligence in the first place, then we should be back there. Otherwise, we're simply ceding that airspace to Russia. So my time's expired. I guess we'll address more of these in a closed setting.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you both for your appearance. I want to extend my condolences as well to the family of General Stewart, who was a trailblazing Marine. I'm surprised it's gotten to me, the seventh questioner, and no one's raised the fact that Russia's government has accused Ukraine of trying to assassinate President Putin and saying that the United States goaded them into it. Seems like kind of a big deal. Big if true, as the kids say today. Dr. Haynes, what do you have to say about these claims from Russia's government?
Well, obviously, you've seen the Ukrainian government deny their, having engaged in this. And at this stage, we don't have information that would allow us to provide an independent assessment on this.
Okay. General Barry?
I think it gets after Senator Sheen's comment about misinformation.
Perhaps some grounds to think that maybe these claims are exaggerated. One, do we know that Vladimir Putin doesn't spend the night at the Kremlin all that much? Is that correct, Director Haynes?
Yes.
Kremlin is not like the White House, in other words. It's not the primary residence of the president of Russia. Even if you were there, these drones from the videos I've seen, they do not appear to be the size of weapons that could do significant damage to the Kremlin. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. They also appear to be the kinds of drones that would require relatively close line of sight control, which means someone on the ground in Moscow, which is not known as an open and friendly city to people who are hostile to the Russian government. Is that correct, General Barry?
Potentially from the photos that I've seen, yes.
In most attacks on Russian soil, Ukraine's government has been ambiguous or silent about responsibility for the attacks. Yet in this case, they've explicitly disclaimed any responsibility. Is that correct, Director Haynes?
Yes.
All right. General Barry, I think you might have been onto something when you said that this sounds like misinformation. I want to move on to another matter, Director Haynes, about Mexican drug cartels. They're causing now more deaths in America than we lost every year in the Vietnam War, or every year in America than the entire Vietnam War. In fact, almost twice what we lost in the Vietnam War due to fentanyl alone. Has the intelligence community produced a national intelligence estimate on the threat that the cartels pose to America?
No, we have not, sir.
So an NIE is the most authoritative written judgment on national security matters. Is that correct?
It is an authoritative. I suspect it would become in list. Yes.
Do you have any plans to produce an NIE on the threat the cartels pose to America?
We do actually have something on our calendar that is on transnational criminal organizations, including the cartels in this space.
Thank you. I think that's warranted, and I'll look forward to seeing it. Director Haynes, you mentioned earlier that it will take Russia years to rebuild its ground forces, and I believe you were saying that to express agreement with General Barry. Is that correct? And General Barry, you believe it will take years for Russia to rebuild its ground combat forces. Most intelligence agencies inaccurately judged the early days of the war. They thought that Russia would roll into Kyiv very quickly and conquer most, if not all, of Ukraine. General Barry, was that a result of our intelligence agencies underestimating the Ukrainians or overestimating the Russians?
Senator, I think it was a combination of both.
Okay. When you're making your own operational plans, you have to make assessments about the adversary, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that's true whether you're operating at the platoon level or at the national strategic level.
Yes.
So it's fair to say, based on the fact that we now know we overestimated Russia's capabilities as of last February, and we've seen their forces degraded to the point it'll take years to rebuild them, that they are a much weaker fighting force than we thought 14 months ago, right?
That is what we currently assess, yes.
Shouldn't our operational plans about a potential war with Russia in Europe then be changed to reflect that new understanding?
I think in the purview of U.S. European Command and the Department of Defense, they're looking at all that, Senator.
Yeah. They need to urgently, because one of the reasons we've heard on this committee about the slow pace at which we're delivering certain weapons is that our operational plans require it. And if our operational plan in Europe is based on what we thought Russia was capable of 14 months ago versus what they are capable now, it badly needs to be revisited. Director Haynes, one final line of questions about Russia. They've gotten a lot more aggressive towards the United States recently. We all remember the Black Sea incident when one of their aircraft downed an MQ-9 drone. The head of U.S. Air Force's Central Command recently said that Russia is, quote, increasingly bellicose towards American aircraft in Syria, suggesting they even are looking for a fight. They're spoiling for a dogfight. And then third, the head of European Command, General Cavoli, recently noted that Russian submarines have gotten more active in the Atlantic than they have been in years. One, are there other instances of growing Russian aggression? And two, what's the intelligence community's assessment for why Russia has grown increasingly aggressive in these ways?
Can we address this in closed session?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator King.
Thank you, Senator Welch. Senator Cotton.
Ms. Peters, it came to my attention that members of this committee submitted written questions the last time you appeared, and I don't think we've gotten responses back. Are you aware of that?
I am, Senator.
Can we count on getting responses to those questions soon?
We are working diligently to get those responses back to you.
What's been the long delay?
You know, it's been a long process. We always want to get these answers right, and there's a review process going back and forth between the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the department to ensure that our answers are consistent with department
Can we get a date certain, like maybe a month from today, October 13th?
Senator, I would love a date certain. Unfortunately, I cannot provide that to you.
No, and I assume you won't provide a date certain any new questions we have then either, right?
That's correct, Senator.
All right, you mentioned in your opening statement you talked to stakeholders and something called justice-involved individuals. What's a justice-involved individual?
Someone who has been involved in the criminal justice system.
So a criminal.
Criminal or victims. We had a listening session where victims also discussed the impact of the criminal justice system.
The reason we don't just call them criminals and victims?
Pardon me?
Is there a reason we don't just use plain English and call them criminals and victims?
Justice-involved individuals is a term that I use regularly.
Okay. You said that you'd been to 20 prisons in the last 12 months. That's about once every 2.5 weeks. On average, how many hours do you spend in a correctional facility when you visit it?
Probably 6 or more hours when I'm visiting.
Okay, so close to a full working day when you're there.
Yes.
How many of those hours do you spend on average with your correctional officers?
Well, when I am there, I spend about an hour with my executive team that's on the ground locally, and then the rest of it is walking the halls of the institution. And I try to stop and talk to every correctional officer.
Any organized sit-down with correctional officers?
We had an organized sit-down with our national union, but it's more walking and talking and meeting with them one-on-one at their post. I prefer that over pulling them off their post to have a conversation.
Got it. Have you visited the Forest City, Arkansas institution?
No, I have not.
Would you like to join me on a visit there?
I'd be happy to join you on a visit.
Because, you know, the incoming union chief who's taken over from Shane Fauci, Brandy White, is an officer at Forest City. I wish we would have had a second panel today with them. We had one last year, but I guess the chairman didn't want to have a second panel with the union members today. I want to touch this augmentee issue. Last year, we passed a law that required your employees to spend 90% of their time on their primary responsibility. If you're a correctional officer, 90% on corrections. If you're an HVAC technician, 90% on HVAC. What is the status today of the 90% requirement? Are you meeting that requirement?
We are working hard to meet that requirement.
That sounds like a no.
And so we are continuing to battle our recruitment and retention
80%?
issues. I don't
70%?
have, yeah, I don't have an overall number for you, Senator.
How can you not have an overall number of what your core officers are doing? Not research associates, not administrative assistants, but these, like this, they perform the mission of your organization, and you don't know how much time they're spending?
Senator, it changes every day and is different at every
There's got to
single
be an average,
institution.
though.
I don't have an average, Senator.
I mean, hitters go over 4 in a day, but they can still hit 350 in a season. There's got to be an average. I'm disappointed you don't have an average. This is not, it's not like some political hot potato. I'm not asking you about men who claim to be women to go into women's prisons. This is like a core responsibility of your organization. Let's turn to why you're not meeting that staffing numbers. You said in your written testimony that you're at 88% funded positions. How many correctional officer positions did the president request and Congress authorize and fund for 2023?
Senator, I don't have that number in front of me, but we can certainly get back to you.
20,446. Do you know what it was last year?
No, Senator.
20,446. How many correctional officers are currently employed?
We, like you just mentioned, the percentage is 88% of the
No,
funded
correctional
numbers.
officers, not total slots, correctional officers. How many do you have?
I don't have that number in front of me, but I can get it and get back to you, Senator.
Ms. Peters, again, these are your primary employees. These are the meat eaters, not the leaf eaters that do all the other jobs. And you don't know how many you have employed? Do you think it's, if you have 20,446 authorized, do you think it's 18,000?
Senator, I know that the number is 88% of those funded positions.
No, that's your total positions.
Yes.
Do you think it's closer to 8,000 or 18,000 correctional officers?
I think it's closer to 18,000, but we can get that number and get back to you.
Kind of right in the middle, maybe a little on the verging towards 8,000. It's 12,731, which say 60% that you had authorized for last year and this year. Yet you're boasting of an 88% total employment rate. And then you're complaining that you don't have enough officers to meet the 90% requirement that we mandated, that President Biden signed into law. It sounds to me like you need to spend a lot more time and money focused on hiring the people who are performing your organization's chief responsibility and less support personnel. Why is your organization at 88% total, but your core job only at 60%?
So, Senator, I don't know what that number is, so I'm not going to say on the record that it's 60%, but we'll get that number and get back to you. But I will tell you all of the majority of our recruitment efforts over the last year has been for those correctional officers.
But you're not meeting it. You're at 88% for overall employees, which includes all those leaf eaters I mentioned. You're at barely 60% for your meat eaters, the people who are doing the main mission of your job. It seems, my time's up here, but it seems to me like the BOP needs to do a much better job recruiting and hiring corrections officers, since that is what you actually do is corrections, and much less time hiring all these other support personnel and headquarters personnel. I look forward to seeing you in Forest City.
Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cotton.
Mr. Vazirani, I've heard reports that former U.S. service members have been approached by communist China and offered jobs that draw on their military expertise to aid the PLA. This is already happening with some of our European partners, veterans, oftentimes through professional military companies in third world countries like South Africa. What steps, if any, is the Department of Defense taking today during the transition process to ensure that our troops are aware of this kind of activity and adequately prepared to resist these offers, especially if done through intermediaries?
Senator, we continue to be concerned about the pacing threat of China and the approach that they take to try and undermine what we're doing. We have provided guidance through the military departments on when our service members there's outreach from malactors. And Senator, I'll be happy to get back to you with the specific steps we've taken and the guidance we provide.
Yeah, could you please get back to me in writing on those steps, and also what mechanisms, if any, you have in place to track these kind of offers? Because I do think it's a growing concern, like I said, with our European partners. But I worry about reports that it's now occurring in the United States as well. I believe that our reserves play a crucial role in the nation's defense by allowing the U.S. to retain critical skills and talents in our services, while also allowing active duty service members to transition into the reserves. Unfortunately, like the rest of the active duty military, the reserves are facing historic shortfalls as well. Has the DoD studied barriers to transitioning into the reserves from the active duty?
Senator, that is, as far as addressing barriers to transitioning to the reserve, we are looking at that. We want to ensure that we particularly as we continue to rely on the reserve component. One of the things we've been doing, we brought on our first Chief Talent Management Officer. An area that we're looking at is permeability between the active and the reserve component, and providing that opportunity for service members to move from one to the other, active to reserve, but also the opportunity to come back into the active component.
Okay. In the studies, has the DoD identified any specific issues that create challenges for transitioning troops who may have gone in the reserves but decided not to?
Senator, if I can take that for the record, and I'll get back to you with the
You may.
specific findings.
One final and related question. Obviously, we want to make sure that every man and woman who wears the country's uniform and wants to leave the service is set up for success in civilian life or in the reserves if they choose to go there. But I'm also curious about barriers to remaining, I shouldn't say barriers, drivers to transition when troops may have stayed on active duty. So as you're studying the challenges that they have in the transition process, have you also studied the main issues that are driving their desire to separate in the first place?
Senator, one of the things that we are seeing now is we're seeing actually record levels of retention.
Yeah.
And so we're benefiting from that, and that's certainly helping us in end strength. When one of the areas that we've talked about during this panel that is a driver for service members to get out is military spouse employment, and the opportunity for a service member's military spouse to also have a successful career and also contribute to the family's financial readiness. So that's an area that we're working very hard on to ensure that military spouses have career opportunities to support their service member, particularly as we look at our model, which typically requires the service member to move every 2 to 3 years.
Okay, thank you.